advanced by the Greeks, not just in art and culture, but also in the employment of arms. In the mid-7th and 8th centuries BC, the Greeks adopted a formation of attack called the phalanx, which was composed of individual soldiers called hoplites. The phalanx was the most formidable method of attack in its day and spread throughout the Mediterranean, finding its way to Rome, as I said, around the mid-500s BC. Put simply, the Greeks abandoned the chaotic charges of man-to-man fighting in favor of a highly organized formation, which would charge and engage the enemy as one. For hundreds of years, the only thing that could stop a phalanx was another phalanx of equal strength, hence the speed of its adoption throughout the Western world. A phalanx was composed of a single line, 8 to 16 men deep, depending on the battlefield and number of hoplites available. As a rule of thumb, deeper was better for phalanxes, and there were accounts of phalanxes up to 50 men deep in some battles. Commanders had to make hard choices, however, because the line had to be long enough to prevent any outflanking maneuver, which meant certain death, so a balance was always sought between length and depth. At Marathon, for example, the Greeks gambled by spreading their phalanx thin to prevent the numerically superior Persians from outflanking them. The gamble paid off, but the Persians nearly did break the thin Greek line, and had they done so, the history of the world would have been altered dramatically. During battle, the men in the front line held their oval shields, called hoplons, hence the name hoplite, in their left hands and long spears in their right. The hoplites stood close together and in such a way that their shield protected the man to their left and the man on their right protected them. This formed a shield wall that was virtually impenetrable. In between the shields, the spears of the second, third, and sometimes fourth ranks shot through the gaps, stabbing and gorging anything they could. A mass of individual fighters would simply be massacred if they attempted a head-on attack. They would be unable to break through a well-disciplined phalanx. Now I know what you're thinking. If a phalanx was 8 or 12 or 16 men deep, and only the front 4 lines were attacking, what were the other 4, 8, or 12 lines doing? The answer is threefold, but all three folds relate to the all-important task of maintaining the cohesion of the phalanx. The first fold is that as the phalanx initially charged each other, and in the subsequent shoving match, the front lines had to be braced by the men behind them, so they literally, physically, could not be pushed back. The second fold is that the most common way a phalanx was broken was by retreat from the rear. Once men started running out the back, there was no more bracing, no more support, and the other army could push right through you. A deep line meant removing those back ranks from danger, and hence removing their desire to run away. The man in the back line of a 16-man phalanx was in no danger of being run through with a spear, so he wasn't going to run. It's basic psychology. The third fold is that the stable back ranks prevented the men in front, who really were in physical danger, from running away even if they were scared out of their minds. If anyone in the front ran, then the whole phalanx would break down and everyone would be slaughtered. Now I know what you're thinking again, and the answer is yes. The first few ranks of a phalanx was a really, really crappy place to be. Trapped between an enemy who was trying to kill you, and friends who forced you to stay put, even as they sat, essentially, on the sidelines. The only way to live if you were in the front was to stick together and move forward, so there was a motivational element to the formation as well. There was, indeed, a lot of psychology built into the phalanx. Maybe all that philosophizing on the human condition paid off. In a warrior society like Greece, though, men clamored to be in the front ranks because that's where all the honor and glory was, and where the commanders placed their best men. So, despite all the dangers, they didn't think the front was such a bad place to be. To each his own, I guess. Now, a last important word on the phalanx. It was designed for and used on flat, open plains, where the ranks could be deployed properly, and there were no holes in the line. In a phalanx, a single gap meant death. The survival of the army was absolutely dependent on an unbroken shield wall. In Greece, this worked well because both sides used phalanxes, and so both sought the same sort of terrain. But against an army who used vastly different tactics on unstable, hilly terrain, the phalanx was vulnerable, a fact the Romans would learn the hard way. In the hundreds of years that all served because they were fighting either other phalanxes or Gallic hordes who were no match for a solid shield wall with hundreds of spears jutting out of it. But when they met the Samnites, the weaknesses of the phalanx became all too apparent. The steep, rough country of Samnium, where most of the fighting of the Samnite Wars took place, made it difficult to deploy and maintain a cohesive phalanx. Plus, the Samnite light infantry and cavalry, used to the terrain, were able to easily outflank the Romans. And as I said, an outflanked phalanx was as good as dead. This fatal flaw spelled the end of the Roman use of the phalanx. It was simply not maneuverable enough. When attacking head-on, a phalanx was indestructible, but once hit from the side or back, it was a sitting duck. The densely packed soldiers simply could not turn and set up the critical defensive shield wall in time, encumbered as they were with heavy armor and long spears. If given enough time, the left or right-hand column could reform into a front line, but in battle time was measured in seconds, and a cavalry detachment that managed to get around the line was charging through the ranks in a heartbeat, slaughtering the closely packed hoplites who could not even turn around to defend themselves. This was why the phalanx had to avoid being outflanked at all costs, and why, when the Samnites proved they could get around the Romans changed forever their organizational deployment to develop an immunity to this chronic disease. What the Romans developed was the system that has been handed down as the classic Republican army formation, which we will talk about in detail next week. The maniple system and its three-line deployment, famously referred to as a phalanx with joints. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Last time, we focused on the Greek phalanx, the formation of battle used by the Roman army until the time of the Samnite Wars. This week I want to talk about the new system the Romans developed during and after their war with the Samnites. The new organizational structure would remain the standard for the next 250-odd years until the Marian reform of 107 BC and become known to history as the maniple system. It was called the maniple system because it was based around a tactile unit of 120 men called the maniple, which roughly translates as a handful. This unit was capable of acting independently of the rest of the army or in concert with the whole, giving Roman commanders an advantage over their predecessors, who had to deal with the bulky single line of a phalanx designed only for closely coordinated forward movement. In a pinch, a general could now order off a single maniple to secure a ridge or plug a hole or turn to face an enemy from behind without jeopardizing the cohesion of the rest of the army. And the new Roman general had another advantage over his predecessor. The Romans abandoned the single line in favor of a staggered three-line deployment. At the outset of battle, the lines formed with 10 maniples in the front, 10 in the middle, and 10 half maniples in the back, arrayed in a checkerboard fashion. Some sources say there were 15 maniples in the front line, and some say there were 15 in the front too. The specifics are hard to weed out due to the lack of source material and the competing claims held therein. So I'm saying 10, 10, and 10 because that seems to be the general consensus, but just know that I could be wrong, and without a time machine we'll never know for sure. Somewhere between 10 and 15 in the front two lines anyway, and definitely 10 in the back. The front-line maniples were made up of the youngest and most inexperienced soldiers, generally aged 16 to 20, out on their first campaigns. The second line was made up of soldiers in the prime of their lives, between the ages of 20 and 40. The back line was made up of the oldest troops, veterans of countless campaigns with all the wisdom and skill that follows from age and experience. Organizationally, each single maniple had 4 officers, 2 front, senior centurions, and 2 back, junior centurions. They were called centurions because they commanded a single century, the most basic organizational unit of the army, and a maniple was composed of 2 centuries, hence 2 officers. A Roman army century was not composed of 100 men, as is commonly and mistakenly believed, but rather 60 to 80 men. The senior of the 2 senior centurions was the commander of the maniple and placed in the front right when in battle. They were expected to lead by example and be the first ones in and the last ones out of any fight. The mortality rate among centurions was thus the highest in the army, but again, as with the front ranks of the phalanx, men clamored for the position because of the honor it brought them and their families. The basic theory was to attack first with the front line only, who, being young, were strong and full of stamina. Ideally, the rest of the army would never have to attack, and the front line would take care of the enemy. But this rarely happened. Inevitably, the second line would be ordered in to support the first. These troops, hardened, strong, and experienced, were usually enough to secure victory. The enemy, worn down from fighting the Roman youth, would be no match for those youth plus an equal number of veterans. If this was not enough, however, the last line was ordered in to support. If this back line got involved, it meant that things were not going well for the Romans, but the old men were usually enough to break the back of a particularly stubborn enemy. The maniple system was based around the principle of time-release freshness. Opponents of Rome would attack all at once and with great fervor, often overexerting themselves by the belief that they could overwhelm the front Roman line easily and move on to the rest of the army. But things were rarely that easy for them, and, bogged down by the front line of Roman youth, the opposing armies became fatigued and were then routed when the rest of the Roman army got involved. Beyond these three basic lines of heavy infantry, there were three other important elements needed to complete the legion as it lined up for battle. First, there was the light infantry, made up of men rich enough to qualify for service, but too poor to afford all the gear needed to survive in heavy infantry fighting. In any given legion, there were between 1,000 and 1,200 of these fighters, lines to mask the size and formation of the Roman army. When the signal for battle was given, the light infantry would rush the enemy and hurl spears and javelins, attempting to disrupt the cohesion and inflict some minor damage, before retreating quickly through the three lines to the back of the legion. Light infantry never made much of a difference in the actual fighting, having served their purpose if the enemy remained in the dark about Roman formations, and eventually, when the state began to take responsibility for the arming of soldiers, the light troops were phased out and folded into the rest of the lines. On the wings, as was typical of the day, the Romans placed the cavalry. Their job was to engage the opposing cavalry and take them out of the fight, so the two infantry lines had to fight head-to-head without help, a fight the Romans always felt they could win. Once the opposing cavalry was out of the way, the Roman horsemen would plunge into the enemy lines and attempt to do as much damage as they possibly could. In addition to these two basic tasks, the cavalry was always watchful of potential flanking maneuvers or surprise attacks from the rear. Constitutionally, the cavalry was initially made up of the richest Romans, the equites, but as the years passed, the Romans farmed out cavalry work to their allies, never being great horsemen themselves. And these allies were the third element needed to complete a standard legion. Also stationed on the wings, between the Roman lines and the cavalry, the allies were somewhere in between heavy and light infantry. Through the Republican period, they were led by Roman officers, but as time went on, they began to be led by their own chiefs, or generals. The allies were required to contribute an equal number of infantry and twice the cavalry that the Romans themselves provided. These draft requirements would cause constant tension between Rome and her subjects, and was the main precipitous for the Latin War, the Latins becoming fed up with sharing equally in the burdens, but getting shafted in the spoils. In total, the Roman fighting strength was optimally between 8,000 and 10,000 men, with 4,200 Roman legionaries, an equal number of allies, and just shy of 1,000 cavalry. The numbers varied based on time, place, and